Thank you everyone for coming today. And just to start this off, I am Tracy Meidel. I am the captain of the investigative division.
I'm Steve Wool. I'm a lieutenant, currently in charge of the Major Crimes Unit and Special Investigative Regional Response Team, which is the team of investigators that look at officer-involved shootings, comprised of the Spokane City Police, Spokane County Sheriff's Office, and Washington State Patrol.
So we are bringing you here to release the information, the redacted police reports, the body camera footage, as well as surveillance footage from the officer-involved shooting at the West Wind, which occurred on May 2nd of this year. And in our efforts to maintain transparency and provide an outlet for question and answers, I am welcoming the opportunity to answer any questions you have at the end of our presentation. We will be giving you context today that gave background and information leading up to the shooting and investigative information resulting from the officer-involved shooting. So as we begin, I want to ask Lieutenant Wool to give you a summary of events.
Okay, this summary was written by the County Sheriff's Department as the lead in this investigation. On 5/2/16, at approximately 14:36 hours, Aaron D. Johnson, 224 of 84, called 911 to report that his roommate Brian had assaulted him at the West Wind Motel at 2701 West Sunset Boulevard, number 217. At approximately 15:09 hours, Johnson called back to 911, reporting that Brian was now threatening him with a knife, but he was unable to give a description of Brian. At approximately 15:11 hours, 911 called Johnson back, and he was now saying that Brian was trying to kill him with a gun. SPD officers Anderson and Phillips arrived on scene at the West Wind Motel at approximately 15:12 hours. They contacted a male in the parking lot who did not know a Brian. They found room number 217 on the east end of the second floor of the West Wind Motel. The door was cracked open. Officer Anderson knocked on the door and announced Spokane Police. Officer Phillips looked into the room and saw a person pointing a gun at the door and heard the person grunt, "Gun." The officers changed their position to create distance. Officer Anderson moving to the east, while Officer Phillips moved to the west. The officers moved to better positions of cover, Officer Phillips to the far end west hallway, and Officer Anderson went downstairs and moved to the west to avoid a potential crossfire. Aaron Johnson exited the room and moved westward down the hallway with a gun in hand extended out in front of him in a shooting position. The gun was pointed in the direction of Officer Phillips. As Johnson approached Officer Phillips at the end of the hallway, Officer Phillips ordered Johnson to get down multiple times. Johnson did not comply, and Officer Phillips, fearing for his life, shot Johnson multiple times with his firearm. After the shooting, Johnson was secured, provided first aid, and room 217 was cleared after nobody was located inside the room. Johnson was transported to Sacred Heart Medical Center and treated for his gunshot wounds. The gun was later determined to be a realistic-looking BB gun. He recovered from his injuries and was later charged by the prosecutor's office with third-degree assault. The officer-involved shooting protocol was invoked at that time by the Spokane Police Department and investigated by the SIR team. SIR team is the Spokane Investigative Regional Response Team, comprised of the Spokane Police Department, the Spokane County Sheriff's Department, the Washington State Patrol, and several outlying agencies that assist.
I'm going to give you some of our CAD information. It's the computer-aided dispatch that officers had at the time of the call that they were responding to. May 2nd at 2:36 in the afternoon, a DV, domestic violence call, was reported by Aaron Johnson. He stated basically that 20 minutes prior, he had been assaulted by a hit in the face by a male named Brian and an unknown last name. He did not want to answer any more questions and thought that Brian would come back, and he hung up. Because it was a call where there was no immediate threat, the suspect had left, and there was no immediate urgent response needed, the call was classified lower in response and didn't require an immediate dispatch. Because of that, the two officers that ended up responding, Officer Anderson and Officer Phillips, self-dispatched themselves to the call and communicated to each other that each were going on the call, the same call. And that was dispatched by themselves at shortly after 3 o'clock, 3:04 and 50 seconds and 3:05 and 01 second. After they had self-dispatched, Mr. Johnson called back and stated into 911 that the Brian, who was a roommate, threatened to kill him with a knife with an unknown clothing description. At 3:10 and 46 seconds, he gave more information saying that he had to go because he thought Brian was coming to get him. At 3:11 and 37 seconds, Aaron called again, saying something about someone trying to kill him with a gun. So, as you can see, it started out as an assault, and then a knife, and then a gun. So, the incident was escalating. Officers arrived on scene, one at 3:12:26 seconds, one at 3:12:33 seconds. So, they responded pretty much simultaneously. At 3:15 and 46 seconds, the first officer is saying that there was a gun being pointed and requesting more units. At 3:15 and 38 seconds, Officer Anderson advised that they had a subject down by the steps and shots were fired. I'm going to read you some excerpts from Officer Phillips' report. Both officers had reports, but because Officer Phillips was the one that fired his gun, I wanted to read you some pieces of the report. I knew that we were advancing towards a potentially very dangerous situation. The door, number 217, was open approximately 6 inches, which increased my suspicions that this call was not what it appeared. Officer Anderson called out, "Spokane Police," and there was no response. I pushed the door open to check the welfare of Mr. Johnson. I clearly saw a dark figure standing at the back of the room, facing out toward us. He was literally standing there with a gun in a shooting position. He loudly grunted the word, "gun." It was clear now. He set up to shoot responding officers. Officer Anderson and I both retreated to areas of cover because they were in a crossfire situation. I saw Mr. Johnson stick his head out the door, searching for where I and Officer Anderson were positioned. Instead of avenues of escape, it appeared Mr. Johnson was actually looking for us or tracking us. Mr. Johnson was walking aggressively towards me with the gun still outstretched in a shooting position. I yelled for Mr. Johnson to stop and commanded he get down, without any response from him. I believed that if I did not use my firearm first, He was going to shoot me. Lieutenant Wool is going to cover the prosecutor's review of this case.
After a thorough investigation by the SIR team, this was forwarded on to Prosecutor Larry Haskell's office, and on July 5th of 2016, he came out with the following news release. The Spokane County Prosecutor's Office has determined that Spokane Police Officer Shane Phillips was justified in the use of deadly force while attempting to contact Aaron D. Johnson at the West Wind Motel, May 2nd, 2016. On May 2nd, 2016, the 911 dispatcher received several calls from Aaron Johnson. Johnson initially reported that he had been assaulted by a roommate, Brian. The initial call contained no information containing weapons. In a second call, Johnson stated that Brian had threatened him with a knife. In a third call, Johnson reported Brian was trying to kill him with a gun. Spokane police units were dispatched to 2701 West Sunset Boulevard, number 217. SPD officers Stephen Anderson and Shane Phillips were first to arrive. Phillips and Anderson made their way up to number 217. The door was partially open, approximately 6 inches. Officers knocked and called out Spokane Police. There was no response. Phillips then entered the room and observed a subject who appeared to be pointing a firearm at them. Johnson, in fact, stated "gun" to Officer Phillips. Phillips exited the room the length of the hallway to the west and took cover. Concerned about possible crossfire, Officer Anderson exited the motel to the east to join Phillips on the west. In the meantime, Johnson entered the hallway from unit number 217 and proceeded to approach Phillips with his gun in hand and fully extended in a shooting position. Phillips was concerned for his safety and that of other guests in that room. Phillips loudly ordered Johnson to stop and get down. Johnson did not comply with Phillips' commands. Feeling the immediate threat for his safety and others, and that Johnson appeared to have this situation set up to shoot police, and that Johnson could start firing at any minute, Officer Phillips fired multiple times at Johnson until Johnson spun and went down. By that time, Officer Anderson had joined Officer Phillips in the hallway, and both approached Johnson and cuffed him. Under these circumstances, it was reasonable for Officer Phillips to use deadly force. Johnson presented a serious and immediate threat to the officers and the safety of others who were staying at the motel. Officer Phillips had a reasonable fear that Johnson could begin shooting at any time. There is no indication Officer Phillips acted out of malice or lacked good faith belief in the correctness of his actions. Therefore, no criminal liability attaches and no criminal charges will be filed against Officer Phillips.
So before we move into the surveillance footage that we'll see first and then the body cam footage second, I wanted to provide some context as to what you will see. The West Wind Motel has 2 stories to it. The incident happened on the 2nd floor. On the surveillance footage, you will see Officer Phillips retreating from left to right across the hall. You will see Mr. Johnson following Officer Phillips. And then on the main level, you will see Officer Anderson going across the bottom. And as the surveillance footage is playing out where there's no audio, Lieutenant Wool will be narrating what you are seeing, so there's no confusion. You will hear and see de-escalation tactics. What I mean by that is choice of words of the officers, tone of voice, creating distance and cover. You will see how quickly Mr. Johnson closes distance toward Officer Phillips. You will also have questions on the things you will see. I ask you to hold those questions until after we watch it, and you will see, and you will be able to ask the questions, and I will be able to answer. But I know there's going to be questions. I don't want to provide any of context of what you'll see so that you can have your own perception of what you'll see in the video. You will see both Officer Anderson and Officer Phillips on the body cam footage. What you won't see is Officer Phillips' body camera footage, as he had, these body cameras that we had at the time were losing their battery life. So some of the officers between calls were powering down to save the battery life. He actually thought he had powered it back on and attempted to turn it on. So Officer Phillips thought his camera was on. But fortunately, we do have not only Officer Anderson's body cam footage, but the other officers that responded to the scene. And you will get all that footage in your packets. There, I believe that I've covered it all. I think we'll just move to the surveillance footage and the body cam footage.
Okay, so we're looking south here. And so the room in question is all the way to the left, which is 217, so the far east end. You will see here shortly Officer Phillips running down the hallway towards cover at the far west end. Shortly after he passes by, you will then see Mr. Aaron Johnson running down with his hands extended, gun out, pointing at Officer Phillips. That's a plexiglass. There's Officer Phillips running away to cover. Here comes Mr. Johnson, gun out, closing distance. At that point, Johnson goes down, and you cannot see him as he's behind that wood-covered part of the hallway there, below the plexiglass.
Just a reminder, there's 30 seconds of no audio while the video of the body camera is buffering.
$217. What's going on, man? What's your name? Anthony? Okay, did you see anybody out here threatening anybody else with a gun or anything like that?
What? No. Did you see anybody out here acting a fool? Not really. I've been right there working.
Okay. Cool.
Oh. What's the name of the guy looking for?
Aaron Johnson.
Aaron Johnson? I have no idea, but the owner is right there with that.
217 right there. Really? Spokane Police. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, you got size point something. Put it down.
Put it down, boss.
He's pointing something out.
Hey, put it down. What's that? Put it down.
Okay, a couple more cars. Interrupt.
Hey, put your hands up, dude. Hands up.
I'm gonna back out. I'm gonna back out the crossfire.
Aaron, put your hands up, buddy. Aaron, put your hands up. Aaron, put your hands up. Yeah, I backed out completely. I'm down by the steps. Shots fired, 99.
Shots fired. 2701. Get there! Crossfire! Crossfire!
281, we got one down. If you could start medics, have them stage.
Okay. Medics on route.
Alright, we're up in the hallway. We both can see each other. We're both good. He's down.
Coming.
I'm good. I'm coming around. Fine, just grab it.
Don't move!
Don't move! You good?
283, they can come straight in. Negative. Secure. What's your name, brother? What's your name? Roll onto your stomach for us. Roll onto your stomach. We're going to be on the second floor. We're going to need everybody to come in from the east end on the second floor, not from the west end.
Are you good cutting them out? I'm good. Okay, I'm going to cover me. Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm going to cover. You're going to cut. Yeah. Ready? Just move in. Yep.
Gotta stay still for me, bud.
Do not move or you will be shot again. Do not move. You're going to cut.
Good.
217.
Cover.
2701. I can't get that hand up.
Tell Huddle to come other side.
283 to Huddle. Do not come in from that end. Do not come in from that end. Come to the east end. I'm sorry, the west end. West end. The west end, not the east end. From the west end now. I watched that hand.
Yep. We got one cuff. What's that? I don't know. We don't know what's down there.
We don't want people walking through here either. The weapon is secure then?
Still want people coming in from the west? Doesn't matter now.
Now come in the other side. You guys are on the wrong side. Come the other side.
The room has not been secured. Okay, let's move up.
We got it. I got him. Okay.
Let's ask him. He has not been frisked.
He's not been touched. He hasn't been searched. Nothing.
Where's your injury at?
Move in. Move in.
We'll take one more up here.
Here, this. We're good here.
Good. Yep.
This one.
Yep. Good. Ready? I'm going in. Ready? Spokane Police Department, you're in here with your hands.
Spokane Police!
Bathroom's clear.
Spokane Police!
Good, Shane? You good?
Bathroom's clear?
Yep.
Office is clear?
281, the room is secure. You okay?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to provide now kind of a summary as to what the investigation revealed. So officers were responding to what came in as a domestic violence call, which was not actually the case. Mr. Johnson suffered from mental illness, and he had planned the event to create a situation where officers were forced to use deadly force on him. A suicide note was also found in the room. Officers were presented with a male holding a gun in a shooting stance and aggressively approaching one of them in an apparent manner to shoot him. After the shooting, officers immediately requested medics, and not knowing if there was a victim actually inside that room, they actually had to wait for backup before they were able to move forward and clear the room. And what you don't see are the officers that came in behind and provided that first aid to Mr. Johnson. During the CERT team investigation, they recovered the firearm used by Mr. Johnson. Only at that time, it was determined to be a BB gun, which was unable to be discerned by the officers at the time. I did want to point out a couple of things. We do have new body cameras that will now rectify the situation for the battery usage and the battery drainage. But also that we have a summary of suicide calls from January to June of 2016. And those are calls that are classified as suicide when they come in, which was not the case in this call, but it ended up being that way. Out of the 556 calls that started out as suicide, only 5 of those resulted in officers using force. So I think what these results show us is that your Spokane Police Department has a commitment to training, but also that continued commitment to train every officer in crisis intervention training, CIT training. And because of that training and de-escalation techniques, we are only using force in such a small percentage, and we are able to actually get help and get relief to the majority of the citizens that we come across. So now I would actually like to open it up to you for any questions that you have.
Sorry, you said 556 calls in 2016 started as suicide, only 5 resulted in deadly force.
Not even
Or
deadly
use of
force, only use of
Okay.
force. And only one of those was actually fatal.
Okay.
So
And that's from January to June, sorry.
yeah, so
Okay.
that's, so less than 1% of the calls that we went on that were typed as suicidal calls actually resulted in force, and not deadly force, but just any
Use of
physical
force.
force. Yeah.
And, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
In this case, it seems officers, and a lot of the other body camera footage we've seen, they start issuing aid immediately, and in this case, they didn't do that. Is that because they hadn't checked that room yet and didn't know, or?
Exactly. So they didn't know who the person was with the gun. And because of the way the call came in, there potentially could be a victim inside that needed aid as well. But it was also unsafe, not knowing who else may be inside that room. And so we did have to wait for backup before moving forward.
If you could see there was only 2 officers at that time, and after the cuffs were applied onto Mr. Johnson, Officer Anderson immediately got his gun out again and was covering that hallway, not knowing if there was another potential gunman down the hallway in that room, or victims or somebody else coming out, now that they heard the commotion and be aggressive towards the officers. So they had to wait for backup before they could render aid and go forward to check out those unknown areas. Yes, sir.
The 2 officers concerned, when they first discovered there was an individual in there with a realistic gun, they immediately obtained cover and concealment, and there seemed to be some time lapse there. Were either one of them equipped with a taser, and if they were, why didn't they try to employ it?
So when officers are faced with deadly force, we are trained to respond to that with deadly force. We are not going to put ourselves in danger of getting shot by a gun because we choose to use a taser. So because the subjects that we encounter are really the ones that determine the force that we use. Because he engaged officers with a deadly weapon, the response is equal force, which would be our firearm and not a taser.
So to have a taser application work appropriately, you've got to be a distance like you and I apart, and it's got to be straight on, and 2 probes come out and have to make contact with the suspect to work, to render him, and part of the time it doesn't even render him incapable of fighting. And so if those for some reason don't work, we've already got a gentleman who's got a gun out pointed at the officers, what they believe to be a real firearm. So the minute they came out and did that, it could have been an exchange of gunfire, at which point the officers are putting themselves in danger by utilizing a taser in that situation versus a firearm, along with other civilians. And so they felt that was more appropriate in that situation to direct, hopefully get commands with their firearms versus a taser.
Yeah, it's perfectly understandable once the fellow came out of the room and their concealment and cover was gone. But could they have not shot around the corner with a taser and disabled him?
You've got to be able to see the target that you're shooting at. We can't just reach around to shoot a gun or a taser. To do that, they're having to put themselves in grave danger by looking at their target. So that distance from you or I, 15 or 20 feet from that room, you're putting your head in that hallway, that's an easy shot that could have easily ended up with an officer being shot and killed. And so they didn't want to put themselves in that situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
How many times did Officer Phillips fire?
9 times.
Where was the suspect hit again?
He was hit multiple times, majority of them in the side and in the back. As you could see, he was coming down and aggressing on Officer Phillips. He was coming right at him. Shots are fired. He is anticipating those shots and turning away as he's falling. And so Officer Phillips is continuing to address the threat. And so some of those rounds are in the side and lower back. And the best analogy I can give in those situations are if you're playing dodgeball or something similar and somebody's going to throw something at you or startle you, the immediate reaction is to turn. And that's exactly what Mr. Johnson did, is he kind of turned away from what he was receiving from Officer Phillips at that point.
Did Mr. Johnson survive? Mr. Johnson did survive, yes.
And what specifically about the body camera changes were you said that they got this police department got new body cameras, or they just updated versions or longer batteries, or what was changed?
They got updated versions of the body camera.
Okay. Is that for every single officer now, or is that phased in, or?
Every single officer.
Okay.
Yep. Yep, it's like a version 1, version 2 type of thing. It's better product, better. I mean, they exchanged all our old ones for the new ones, and so they're all carrying the new ones.
When did that happen?
Real recently, in the last couple months.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did Johnson fire at all?
No.
When was the problem detected that those lapses in battery, that officers were having to turn on and off their battery packs in between calls? When was that found out to be a problem?
I actually don't have that information, but we can find it for you.
Okay.
It was during the pilot series that they were using those, and so it was probably during the testing period that they realized that wasn't the case, and so they were trying to fix that themselves. And that, instead of doing that, we went back and got a better product.
Don't they already always turn them off between calls, or because they're not always recording, right?
It was just turning off the recording and completely powering it down are two different things.
Oh, okay.
So to save the battery life,
They were powering down all the way.
down.
Okay.
Correct.
And now they're just turning on and off the recording.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
On the surveillance video, there's some particle board on the second floor balcony that explodes at the very end of that surveillance video. Did y'all ever determine what made that wood want to fly out like that?
We did. During the investigation, that was one of the rounds from Officer Phillips. So a threat, when you decide to engage somebody, just as your mind and you realize that that's a threat and you want to engage, it takes a second to realize it's a threat and go. The mind does the same thing when the threat's starting to go down. And so as he's starting to go down, Officer Phillips is still seeing that as a threat and firing. So he's going down, and one of the rounds came through and hit that particle board, and that's what you see explode out there.
Do you feel that Officer Phillips fired those rounds from his position behind the brick wall, or had he retreated further down the stairwell and was more shooting at ground level on the second floor?
We believe from his location is that he was behind cover, kind of from that location that he was at when Officer Anderson came up behind him, firing down that way. And that's kind of the path that the bullets went.
Mr. Haskell made his determination based solely on the facts involved in this use of deadly force, but this is not the first time that y'all have been involved in deadly force with Mr. Johnson.
That is correct.
Can you tell me something about that incident?
We did have an officer-involved shooting several years ago, I believe in 2012, where Mr. Johnson was also involved in a shooting with Spokane Police, where he was unfortunately assaulted at that time, or shot as well at that time.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So when the 911 calls were coming in and you were receiving those calls, did his name not come up as someone who has had an incident like that happen before?
No, it didn't come up. What the officers knew at the time was he had a misdemeanor warrant. He had been on one of our internal flyers as a suspicious person, convicted felon, a violent offender, was called active on Department of Corrections, and he was suspended as far as his driver's privileges. Other than that, nothing showed to officers that he had any sort of diagnosed mental illness, that he had been involved with officers in the past, with the critical incident prior. So officers had no prior knowledge of that going into this situation.
Is there some system in place that might have picked that up?
So what we're doing is anytime we have a critical incident, we're doing a review board to look at what we can learn from, what we did good, what we did bad, what we can learn and do better next time. And so one of the recommendations is to look for radio being able to say this person had been involved in a previous encounter, a violent encounter with police or with civilians, so that kind of gives us an idea of what to expect, at least knowledge as we go into that call. So that's something that we learned from this situation. And Mr. Johnson, without violating HIPAA, was gone at a hospital at this point for an extended period of time. So we hadn't dealt with him for a while.
Do you have any idea where that info would be stored, where it would be? Where would the home for that information be?
The information that he had been involved in a previous encounter?
Yeah, and for other.
That would be distributed from our radio to the officers. So from our radio, it would be kept in a database.
So if the call comes in and they get dispatched and they say, hey, this is the caller or the person, they would be able to pull up his past moving forward, so officers could have a better idea of what they're walking into.
Correct.
And is that already started, or is that something you're trying to implement?
That is actually something they're looking at doing right now. because of the deadly force review board that we held on this situation, they're putting those in place so that, and looking at the best way to do that and give that information to the officers. And so that's a work in progress.
So Mr. Kurtz at the House of Charity created the situation. Mr. Johnson baits you into coming to the West Wing. At what point did y'all just stop going to calls for service and have to start worrying about, is this a legitimate call for service or is this an ambush? I mean, that must be terrible for your officers to no longer just chase crime, but oh my gosh, is somebody trying to kill me?
Right. That's a great question. In that situation, unfortunately, this was the third of officer-involved shooting that weekend. So in a small amount of time, we had those situations occur. The first one being the House of Charity with Mr. Kurtz. So could that have led Mr. Johnson to believe, I'm wanting to do this, I'm setting this up, and seeing it on the news, seeing it in the papers, deciding that this is my time to do this? Could that have happened? Sure. That's what we believe. And so when you've got three of them happening like that, that definitely concerns us. And I think that was on the mind of most officers that were working patrol that weekend is, what are we going to walk into that day and what are we going to be put in front of? So it's a great question.
And that is where the training and experience comes into play, where you have consistent training and officers de-escalate and have to escalate at times depending on the scenario that they're giving, and it can change at any moment.
Like Officer Phillips says in his report that the captain read, he knew then at that point, once he got to the room and things just looked amiss, that this wasn't what it was intended to be, that he wasn't calling reference an assault, that he was there for another reason when they saw him with a gun pointed at them. And so I think they were starting to realize that, and that's when they started that de-escalation of, sir, just put the gun down, backing out, trying to prevent distance so they wouldn't increase that propensity for violence.
But when he starts chasing you with a gun, you've run out of options.
Yep.
So going back to the Officer Phillips shooting 9 times, you said that that Johnson tried to turn away. So at that moment, why did Mr. Phillips fire so many shots if he was already turning away from him?
So if you guys saw that video, how quick were those shots fired? I mean, it's a matter of seconds, and you're firing 9 shots. So you're seeing it as a threat. He's coming at you. You're firing. And he's still coming at you. And so within 3 seconds, all those shots are fired. And then at that point, whether he's looking behind for the other officer who he knew was down at the other end, or he's looking to get away, or he's anticipating those shots coming, so he's turning away, then all of a sudden he goes down. So those shots were fired in a very, very quick succession.
Is it clear in the surveillance video that as long as Mr. Johnson is in view of the surveillance video, that he has that pistol in his hand?
You betcha, and is a threat at that point. And he was still alive and moving on the ground, and so they were able to keep kind of eyes on him and contact with him and asked him to get onto his stomach. But you guys saw the gun was still on the ground there. And at that point, they believed that to be a real firearm. In fact, as the investigative response team there, I was at that scene and in a command post. For several hours into that call, we believed that to be a real firearm until the overall pictures were taken, diagrams measured, until they went up and actually looked at the firearm and found out that it was a replica firearm. We believed it to be a real gun at that point. In fact, we had one of our PIOs start up a press release saying that he had a weapon because that's what we believed it to be at that time.
As far as the body cameras, have you had any other similar incidents with officers using force and their body cameras not being turned on back when you had those body cameras?
We can't really talk to that. I can't really talk to that. I'm not aware.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. But this is a good example of body cameras are a tool, and they are a good tool for us, but they don't always capture everything that we would like it to. In this case, we had great surveillance footage that captured a good amount, but we just need to recognize that our body cameras are just a tool, and that it's technology and they can fail.
Where in the process of writing the report, either the officers or the supervisors reviewing it, does the body camera footage get reviewed in that process?
So we, as the investigative team, will download and take that information and look at it, because that's going to help us investigate the scene and determine what occurred and kind of rebuild it and collect the evidence that we need to collect. So that is almost simultaneously after the event. we're already collecting that and looking at it as a piece of evidence.
And who all has access to that body before it is released to the public? Who has access to that?
No civilians, just the investigative team and officers.
Which officers?
Depends on the situation. Not like if I'm involved in a critical incident and I'm wearing a body cam and Captain Meidel's not on the call, she's not going to have access to my body cam. So it's the investigative team at that point, and then the officers that are wearing the body cam, they have the opportunity to review what their body cam caught since they're on there.
And once it's ingested, cannot people like Mr. Haskell actually be able to go to evidence.com and see that video almost immediately?
Once that is then turned over to Mr. Haskell's office, then they will also get that as evidence. They don't, view that while we're doing our investigation. They want it to be a clean investigation that we're in charge of, and we hand over to them once it's complete.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Again, very much for coming.